Thanks for joining us today again. Let me give you the daily update on the COVID statistics. The total number of positive cases reported yesterday was 1,433. That represents 7.9% of the total number of tests, and the total number of confirmed cases is therefore now 68,444. 602 of today's new cases were in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, 318 in Lanarkshire, 163 in Lothian and 88 in Ayrshire and Arran. The remaining 262 cases were spread across 8 other health board areas. I can also confirm that 1,257 people are currently in hospital, which is an increase of 3 from yesterday, and 94 people are currently in intensive care. That's 2 more than yesterday. And finally, I deeply regret to say that 50 deaths have been registered in the past 24 hours of patients who first tested positive over the previous 28 days. That means that the total number of deaths under our daily measurement is now 2,927. National Records of Scotland has also just published its weekly update. That, of course, includes cases where COVID is a suspected or contributory cause of death. Today's update shows that by Sunday just past, the total number of registered deaths linked to COVID, either confirmed or presumed, was 4,649. 167 of those deaths were registered last week. That's 61 more than in the week previous. Of last week's deaths, 127 occurred in hospital, 31 in care homes and 9 at home or in another non-institutional setting. Now, I report all of that as statistics, but particularly when we have numbers such as those I've reported today, it's always really important to remind ourselves that these deaths are not and should never simply be seen as statistics. Every single one of them represents an individual who was cherished and loved and whose loss has been mourned by families and friends across the country. So again, I want to send my deepest condolences to all those who have been bereaved as a result of this virus. I'm joined today by Jason Leitch, the National Clinical Director. I'm also joined today by Martin Blunden, Scotland's Chief Fire Officer, who is going to say a few words shortly about fire safety. As we look ahead to what will, of course, be a very different 5th of November from those that we are used to. The Scottish Parliament yesterday discussed longer-term measures to prevent the misuse of fireworks, but there is also an immediate need to ensure that this year's Bonfire night passes safely, and the Chief Fire Officer will talk more about that shortly. Before then, I want to cover 2 points, and I will do so reasonably briefly. Firstly, just a quick return to the situation in relation to furlough payments. As you know, the Scottish Government welcomes the fact that the current furlough scheme has been extended until the 2nd of December. That will help employees and businesses across Scotland and the UK who need to use it over that period. However, we continue to make the case, as do our counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland, that the same level of furlough support must also be available after November. The same level of help for the self-employed should also be made available. We cannot have a situation where businesses are fully supported, rightly fully supported, when England enters a lockdown, but comparable support isn't made available if all or part of Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland face similar restrictions. So I very much welcome the apparent commitment of the Prime Minister to equal treatment that he gave in the House of Commons on Monday afternoon. As a result of that commitment, we hope and expect that the furlough scheme will be available at its current levels, those levels that will apply through November if we need to impose stronger restrictions in any part of the country in the future. But we have still not seen any detailed written commitments on this from the Treasury, and we need to do that as a matter of urgency. The current confusion and lack of clarity is, and I think this is an obvious point, not helpful for our decision making, but it is not helpful for businesses and employees who, of course, are anxious about jobs and wages at this time. So I hope, although I'm mindful I said the same thing at this point yesterday, I hope we will get that clarity over the course of today. Second point I want to highlight also relates to support for businesses. Back in July, we announced £38 million of support for new companies in emerging sectors of the economy, as well as supporting existing businesses through this crisis. We want to support the sustainable recovery of the economy in ways that help us meet our challenges of the future, not least climate change. That support included a £25 million fund for recent startups. That's been shared today between 90 businesses. They will receive a combination of grant and investment funding worth up to £300,000. These companies are operating in areas which are likely to grow in importance in the years to come. Areas like software development, space engineering and sustainable packaging. So we hope that this support will help them to innovate and grow despite the crisis currently being caused by COVID. Today's funding also shows the mix of measures we're looking at as we try to support economic growth both throughout and in the future as we emerge from this crisis. It's vital for businesses across the country that we work with the UK Government and agree the details of furlough support. But of course, the Scottish Government is also responsible for deciding funding for some major economic interventions, whether that's business rates relief and the support grants available for companies which are hit by COVID restrictions. But alongside that help, we are also responsible for more targeted measures. So today's support is an example of that, and we hope it will help a relatively small number of companies, but companies that have significance for the future, innovate, build and grow. These are the two main points I wanted to cover today, but before I hand over to the Chief Fire Officer, I just want to emphasise again the current rules and guidance. And I want to repeat that although we continue to see some positive signs in our data just now, and that's all down to the sacrifices people across the country are making, we still are dealing with a very fragile and volatile situation. And therefore, it is, I'm afraid, the case that we still have a lot of work to do. As I set out yesterday, given the nature of what we are dealing with right now, it's not enough and we cannot take sufficient comfort from a situation where we stop the spread of the virus deteriorating. We also need to be seeing a significant and sustained improvement. Otherwise, the risk we would bear is going deeper into the winter with a high baseline of infection. And that would mean any increase in the R number could quickly see the virus overwhelm us and overwhelm our hospitals. So we'll be monitoring the situation closely ahead of the first review of our new levels system next Tuesday. In the meantime, though, I ask everybody to remember that we all have a part to play in this. The more all of us abide by the rules, the more chance we have of making the progress we need to see. And it's another opportunity to remind everybody that though this virus makes us all feel a little bit powerless and at times bewildered, none of us are powerless in the face of this. If we all stick to the rules, we make an individual and a collective impact on the spread of it. So let me just briefly and in conclusion remind you what these rules are. If you are living in one of the areas categorised as level 3 at the moment, and that is most parts of the Central Belt and now also Dundee, do not travel outside your own local authority area unless it is essential. You can find more detail of what we mean by essential on the Scottish Government website, but it includes, for example, work that you can't do at home or caring responsibilities. And people in other parts of Scotland should not travel into level 3 areas except for the same essential purposes. We're also asking you now not to travel outside of Scotland to other parts of the UK or overseas, again, unless there is an essential reason for you to do so. This is, I know, very restrictive, but it is essential to avoid us taking the virus from areas of high prevalence into areas of low prevalence, and that point it's important to stress. In addition to the travel restrictions across the country right now, none of us should be visiting each other's homes, again, except for specific purposes like childcare or looking after a frail or vulnerable person. When we do meet people from other households, outdoors or in indoor public places, please stick to the limits, no more than 6 people from no more than 2 households. Avoid car sharing if you can. work from home if you can, download the Protect Scotland app, and remember the 5 rules that everybody needs to abide by to minimise the risk of transmission. Wear face coverings when you're out and about, avoid places with crowds of people, clean your hands regularly, clean surfaces regularly, keep 2 metres distance from people in other households, and self-isolate and get tested if you have any of the symptoms of COVID. I set this out in some detail yesterday, and you'll hear me say it regularly over the course of the days to come. We have taken early action in Scotland. Your sacrifices are adding to that to put us in not a strong position, because no country in the face of a global pandemic can claim its position is strong, but put us in a position that is less severe than many other countries across the world. But it is a fragile position, and we must continue to see progress. That obviously will guide decisions government takes, but right now that need to continue to suppress the virus if we are to avoid tougher restrictions that last for longer is something all of us need to remember in complying with all of this advice and with all of the rules. So my thanks again to everybody for joining us today and for all the sacrifices you continue to make. I'm now going to hand over to the Chief Fire Officer, who's going to look ahead to Bonfire Night tomorrow.
Thank you, First Minister. COVID-19 has had a massive impact on all of our lives, and we've just heard from the First Minister about how that continues to be the case. This year, Bonfire Night is going to feel very different, and at this usual time for celebration, I'm asking you to take greater care than you would normally have done so. The cancellation of many of the organised displays across Scotland may mean that you're considering private displays in your own garden. If you're considering doing that, please remember the COVID restrictions of no more than 6 people from a maximum of 2 households in your garden. If you're thinking of a private display, be kind. Think about those with sensory impairments or with neurological differences such as autism. Think about older people, and think about those with pets, those people who may be affected by your display. This is already a very busy time of the year for the emergency services. Last year we attended 760 incidents in the 24-hour period of Bonfire Night. 540 of those were between 5 o'clock in the evening and midnight, and 90% of all of those incidents were deliberate incidents and deliberate fires. It's very important that we do everything to reduce the strain on the emergency services during this time, to make sure that we're available for other emergencies as they occur. The consequences of accidents involving fireworks are often life-changing, and it's often in the private displays where we see these sort of things happening. So I'd encourage you to go to our website, firescotland.gov.uk, and familiarise yourself with the guidance that we have there to make sure that your display in your own garden is a safe display. If you are going to have a private display, there are some very simple rules to follow. Please only buy fireworks with the CE mark on them. Please only buy them from a recommended or recognised retailer, and please keep them in a metal box and take them out only one at a time. Please follow the instructions for the use of the fireworks that are written on the firework. Please read those before the event in the daylight, or use a torch. Please don't use a naked flame to do that. Light the fireworks at arm's length and use a taper, and never go back to a firework once you've lit it. Even if it goes out, please don't attempt to relight it. Please don't put fireworks in your pockets, and please don't throw fireworks. If you're going to have a bonfire, please don't use paraffin or petrol to light your bonfire. And once your bonfire's lit, please don't then leave it unattended. We have many, many bonfires across the whole of Bonfire Night where they spread and affect property, and fire spreads very quickly, so please don't leave it unattended. Look after it. And if you're going to use sparklers, please look after the children that are using sparklers. Sparklers are pretty, they're simple, they delight everyone, but they are one of the most dangerous fireworks that you can give to a small person. Please don't give them to someone under 5. Please light them singularly. Please supervise children when they're using them. And please, when they're used, take them and put them end down in a bucket of cold water. Sparklers burn between 10 times and 20 times more than burning water, so over 1,000 degrees centigrade, and children get very severe burns from fireworks, particularly sparklers. And light them one at a time. Now, I recognise that many of you, these seem like a lot of things to be considered just to have fun in what has been and continues to be a very difficult time for us all. We can all do our part by remembering how dangerous bonfires and fireworks can be, and be kind, smart and safe as we celebrate this year's Bonfire Night.
Many thanks indeed, Martin. As you know, I've been joined here on several occasions by the Chief Constable and have taken the opportunity then to thank our police officers and police staff across the country. I want to do the same today to our firefighters. The Fire and Rescue Service is an integral and important and highly valued part of Scotland's response to situations like the pandemic. They do a tremendous job, and my thanks go to all of our firefighters and the staff who support them across the country. But let me also just briefly underline the Chief Fire Officer's remarks. All of that advice should be followed for your own safety and the safety of those around you. But when you think about how you're going to behave on Bonfire Night, also think about the experiences of our firefighters and don't act in a way that puts added pressure on those who put their own lives in danger to keep the rest of us safe. So please follow all of the advice that you have just heard. We're going to move now to questions. As I said a moment ago, Jason Leitch is also with us and will help us answer the questions, but I'll go firstly to Gordon Cree from STV.
Thank you. First Minister, I think a lot of people are going to be taken aback by that deaths figure today. I just wonder whether you feel that's part of a trend or if it's a bit of an outlier today. And also if you feel that because of the restrictions we have in place and the way it's been managed, are we currently in maybe a flatter but longer curve than we were with the first wave back in the spring? And if I can ask Professor Leitch just what he makes of the comments today from the Royal Colleges about the need for a balance between COVID and non-COVID treatments in our hospitals in the coming months.
Thanks, Gordon. I'll hand over to Jason in a second. Of all of my responsibilities, the one that I hate most at the moment is having to stand here and announce numbers of people who have died, and whether that's one or, unfortunately, as it is today, 50, that's something that we always have to take very seriously. In answer to your question, is it part of a trend or an outlier? We will almost by definition not know that until we see the next few days' data. We have had a higher number of deaths in recent weeks than we saw over the summer, but this today is higher. I think we had 38 on one day last week. I would make 2 points about the numbers for people dying. First is what I report here on a daily basis is deaths registered in the past 24 hours. And clearly there is always and can be a gap between somebody actually dying and their death being registered. So we publish on the website deaths by date of death, but always remember that the number I'm announcing on a daily basis may average out over a number of days in terms of when people actually die. The second point I'd make, which you've heard us make often, and Jason may want to say more about it, and forgive the kind of insensitive technical sounding language here when we're talking about human beings dying. But in the context of the virus, the figure for the number of people dying is what we describe as a lag indicator. The numbers of people dying now is reflective of people catching the virus maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it's not the most reliable indicator of the spread of the virus right now. It reflects the position a couple of weeks ago or perhaps even longer than that, and that is something we have to take account of. The more up-to-date figures that reflect the position now are the case numbers and the test positivity. We've got a higher number of cases today, but a lower test positivity because yesterday there were more tests done than had been the case on the previous day. We're seeing a slight flattening off of hospital admissions and ICU admissions just now, which again, too early to be definitive, but would also be another encouraging sign. And before I hand over to Jason, your question about are we in a flatter but longer sort of scenario right now, that may be the case, and that's one of the judgments we have to make. You heard me talk yesterday, I've repeated some of this today, is that, sort of flattening things is good, but if they flatten at quite a high level, stabilise at quite a high level, it is not necessarily a good enough position to be in, because we go into a very challenging period where if we're at a high baseline, potentially quite small increases could quickly overwhelm us, and that will be one of the judgments we're making in the next few days. Not just are we seeing an improvement, but are we seeing a significant and rapid enough improvement that is taking the infection level down quickly enough. And obviously we'll not be just looking at that across the whole country, we'll be looking at that in different areas as well. But I'll hand over to Jason, who might want to add to that, but also address the specific question about the Royal Colleges.
Yeah. So I would also start with my condolences to these families. Nobody wants to read out 50 deaths, 38 deaths, any number of deaths. And it does feel like a high number. It is too high. Remember, this relates to people who were admitted and then in intensive care probably 2 to 3 weeks ago, when those numbers were higher than they are now. So as we've said many times here, this virus doesn't work in 12 hours. It works in 2-week chunks, kind of. Some people shorter, some people longer. So you get sick, you get very sick, and then unfortunately, particularly if you're elderly, you're at risk of dying. And that's what this 50 looks like. That's no consolation and no comfort to those who have lost family members. I don't know if others feel like this, but the numbers in Glasgow and Lanarkshire and elsewhere, I feel as though they're getting closer to... I now know more people with this disease than I have known for some time. My family have connections to people who have this disease and people who are in hospital. The numbers are too high. And that's why we need to answer the key question is, are we flattening or are we beginning to fall? We have to turn that curve. And that's what all the restrictions are about. And it's why we're imploring people to follow them. It's why we also moved to this tier system to apply particularly difficult restrictions in the areas where those numbers are highest. So 602 cases in the last 24 hours in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, 318 in Lanarkshire. I am as confident as I can be in the advice that Gregor and I and others are giving the First Minister, that we are seeing a slowing of that number and therefore in hospital and ICU admissions, and that will eventually translate into a fall in mortality, but not today. Your second point is, I agree with the Royal Colleges. The Royal Colleges are one of our key stakeholder groups. They speak for the broad clinical community, the dentists, the nurses, the doctors, and they give us excellent advice, and they are right to warn us, again, that this is winter. Winter is always challenging for the health and care system, and now we have COVID. We have 2,000-3,000 beds potentially reserved for COVID cases. We don't want to use them. We want the restrictions to work. But if we have to use all of them and we have to fill intensive care with COVID cases, of course that has an effect on what you were planning to do with those beds in ICU. And we're doing our absolute best to keep elective surgery open. There was a winter plan published just in the last few days, and then a winter plan for social care published by the Cabinet Secretary and debated yesterday in the Parliament. So everything we're doing is to try and keep that open. But the reality is, if your COVID numbers go up, something has to give, and that may well be elective surgery, tragically.
Thanks. Andrew Kerr from BBC.
Thank you, First Minister. You focused on the need for flexibility in furlough. Do you accept much more might be needed to help the hospitality sector actually survive the winter? And just secondly, we've spoken to 2 people who shielded in the first wave. They've had to leave home to go to work, yet the government texts are telling them to limit their contacts. They don't understand why they're not being asked to shield again. Can you reassure them that the current guidance is sufficient? Thank you.
I am going to hand over to Jason in a second, more substantively on shielding. It's one of the, much of what I'm dealing with just now, I am not a clinician, I am not a public health expert. I rely heavily on clinical advice. I take responsibility for the decisions we make, but particularly on shielding, I listen very closely to the clinical advice that I get, because it is really important that we give advice to people in the shielding category that is designed to keep them as safe as possible, but not restrict their lives any more than is necessary, because the shielding category over months from the spring through to the summer lived with the most extreme restrictions. So that is a constant consideration to get that balance right. And we have in the new strategic framework, of course, we give advice at each level to those in the shielding category and continue to try to make sure that advice is appropriate for the situation we're in. I would also appeal to employers to be very sensitive to the needs of any of your workers that are in the shielded category. Obviously, I'm not going to comment on the individual cases you've briefly cited, because I don't know the details of them, but I would ask all employers to pay very close attention to that. Jason will say more about shielding. The first part of your question on hospitality, look, the Scottish Government is providing as much support as we can within the constraints of our budget. We don't have the borrowing powers that the UK Government holds, so we operate within a largely finite budget. And we are seeking to maximise that as much as possible. In fact, the support we have committed to for businesses, not just in hospitality, but any businesses that are closed or restricted, actually goes beyond the funding commitments we have from the UK Government, although we are operating on good faith that those funding commitments are going to follow. But I do think, and I've said this before, that what we are offering is the maximum we can offer, but it is the minimum, I think, that is needed, and therefore we continue to press the UK Government. And I will be fair to the UK Government, they have also done a lot in terms of business support, but I think we need to see more of that, and that will be an ongoing discussion that we have. Jason, do you want to say a bit more about shielding?
Briefly, I think you covered it bluntly. Shielding was horrible, absolutely horrible, and we don't do it then or now lightly. It's really important that people protect themselves, but the social isolation, the isolation even inside own families, separating families inside houses, was really, really horrible, and not a price we want to pay again if we can. That's why we've made the advice a little more individual, so people can go, they can do individual risk assessments for themselves, they can talk to their clinicians about how they should behave. The fundamental advice is be even more careful than the rest of the people in your tier group. That's the fundamental advice. Whichever tier you're in, be even more careful than the other people in your tier group. And I would also resonate with the First Minister's plea for employers to be very sensitive to those who are simply worried about their risk and what they bring as their person and their disease into their workplace. And I would ask them to be sympathetic to that and allow them to work from home if they can, and protect them at work if they can't.
Tim Batchel from ITV Border.
Thank you, First Minister. A lot of businesses in the south of Scotland trade across the border. From tomorrow, they're going to be faced with two very different sets of rules in England and Scotland. We've spoken to one business in Annan, which has an office in Cumbria as well. It needs to keep staff travelling back and forth over the border. So do you accept that the different approaches mean it's going to be very difficult for some of these cross-border firms and communities in the coming weeks? And also, are you considering putting the don't travel advice into regulation? And if so, when could that happen?
Yes, we are considering that. I've just spent the morning with the COVID committee of the Scottish Parliament and said as much there. I will probably say more about that. We haven't taken a final decision yet, but we'll say more about that at the next review point on Tuesday. The caveat I've always inserted there, which I'll do again, is that by the nature of what we're talking about here, and I've sort of summarised this with the blunt phrase, the police can't check everybody's journey. Whether you have travel restrictions in advice or in law, we rely to a large extent on people abiding by that. So that's why I would ask people to just think about the reasons why we're restricting travel, because this is an infectious virus and we don't want to take it from high prevalence areas to low prevalence areas. In terms of your question about the South, yes, I appreciate that makes a really difficult situation for businesses even more difficult, but we have differential restrictions in place right now in different parts of Scotland, and there's a balance to be struck here, and I'll talk just about Scotland at the moment, but it applies across the UK. We can take a one-size-fits-all approach, but that will at some points, and would be the case in Scotland at the moment, and certainly would have been the case over the last couple of weeks, that you have some areas living with much tougher restrictions, not because of the circumstances of the virus in their area, but because of the circumstances somewhere else. So we're trying to be targeted and proportionate for as long as we can. But that does mean if you're going to have a differential approach for those good reasons, you have to accompany that with travel restrictions. Otherwise, people can go from a high prevalence area with tough restrictions to a low prevalence area in order to go to a restaurant or a pub, but they risk taking the virus with them. So in all of this, there are just trade-offs we have to make. And, you can argue one way or the other. You can argue that the other approach with a one-size-fits-all, so a business has exactly the same restrictions in all parts of the country, is a better approach. But the price of that is that a business in, take the Scottish context right now, a business in the Highlands is going to be under much greater restriction than a business than they would otherwise have to be, because that will be getting driven by prevalence rates in, say, Glasgow. So that's just the complication of the situation that we face. Jack Foster from Global.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Just wondering, on the lack of clarity regarding furlough funding, you've suggested that if that isn't confirmed, it could influence whether or not Scotland might go into lockdown prematurely. Since your initial warning on that earlier in the week, you do appear to have pulled back on the urgency there, despite the fact that there hasn't been any clarity. If the UK does come out with some sort of statement saying that there won't be furlough beyond December 2nd in the event of another lockdown in Scotland, should we be bracing for a lockdown sooner, as you intimated earlier in the week, especially in light of obviously the number of deaths that we saw today, which will be causing some alarm, I imagine?
Look, the decisions are not as crude as this. And I try to kind of explain the subtleties and the nuances and the factors we have to take account of. Firstly, if the UK government comes out and says there is no extended furlough for Scotland beyond the 2nd of December, I'll be very, very, very disappointed. And that's me using as diplomatic a word as I possibly can, because it would run counter to the interpretation that the Prime Minister allowed to be put on his remarks the other day. So I am expecting, I really want to see the detail, and I'm frustrated at not having seen the detail, but my expectation is that the Treasury are beavering away on that right now, and we're going to see the detail soon. And if that's not the case, I think not just me, but I think people across Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland will also be very, very disappointed and concerned by that. What I said yesterday, the reason we need that clarity is for the peace of mind, or as much peace of mind as we can give people and businesses across the country. But it's also for the Scottish. I want us to be able to take rational decisions. I don't want us to have to distort rational public health decisions to try to fit into a time-limited financial offer. So it's really important to have that certainty for clarity as well. And I have made the judgment right now, given that I am expecting the Prime Minister's commitment to be honoured, that we continue to take those rational decisions in our own timescale, driven by the public health data. It's never going to be as crude as the availability of furlough means lockdown, and the lack of it means not. But of course, if you're looking at a situation where you think, a decision may be necessary in a couple of weeks, but if you take it now, you give people better financial support, it can have be a factor in that sort of tipping the balance. But I hope we get this clarified, and we will then continue to take careful, cautious, rational public health decisions in Scotland. That has served us, not perfectly, because we're not in a perfect situation, but that approach, I think, has served us relatively well so far. And let's try to stick to it, rather than have our decisions distorted by the fact that we don't control the finances, and those who do control the finances are not acting fairly. I hope that is not what happens.
Just to pick up on that, though, to use your own words, I mean, do you see a situation where you would have to distort those decisions if the UK government isn't forthcoming on this?
Well, I'm assuming they will be, and unless you're about to tell me the Prime Minister is going to completely renege on the commitment he stood up in the House of Commons and gave, in which case I will stand here and say that I've been proved wrong. But I'm going to choose to believe that the Prime Minister is going to stick to that commitment and is going to ensure that the Treasury provides the detail of that commitment. And then we won't be in these situations. If we end up in that situation, I'll have to stand here and tell you how that influences our decision making. But is it not reasonable for me as First Minister to say, let's not do that. Let's not get into a situation where we're having these important decisions distorted. Let's argue for the rational outcome. And given that the Prime Minister appears to have committed to that, let's try and get the detail that gives us confidence in that. We're all dealing with horrendously difficult decisions right now, and a lot of that is inescapable and inevitable. We don't need to have the situation further complicated by decisions that are not necessary or inevitable. Jack Foster, I've just asked Jack Foster, Katrine Bussey from PA.
Hello, First Minister. I'm struck today again by the continuing high number of cases of infection that we're seeing in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board area. Given that Glasgow was the first place to have a ban on household visiting imposed on it, and that was now more than 2 months ago, is there a reason why the number of infections in Glasgow appears, certainly to me, to be so stubbornly high? And also, just following on from what Jack was saying about furlough funding and lockdown, Willie Rennie, the Scottish Liberal Democrat leader in the Scottish Parliament yesterday, suggested that if there was no clarity from the UK government on this issue, you could announce a lockdown as early as Thursday, tomorrow. Is that something you can rule out?
I'm not planning to do that, and I'm not going to take decision. It is, not for that reason. I think Willie will be reflecting a conversation I had with party leaders in an effort to keep them updated on Monday, which since that conversation was before we had the Prime Minister's commitment in the House of Commons. So I am taking that commitment as a positive signal, but also, I want, as far as possible, to keep to the time, stick to the plan we set out, keep to the timescales. If we have to change that for good data-driven reasons, and try to avoid, as far as possible, having to change course because of irrational decisions that are being taken elsewhere, and that's what I'll seek to continue to do. On the situation in Glasgow, again, what you often find here is kind of trying to prove a negative, if you like. The situation in Glasgow is still of concern. If we hadn't had these restrictions, I suspect we'd be seeing a much, much more severe situation in Glasgow than the one we do. So there is no doubt that the restrictions that have been in place that are really difficult for people, I'm a resident of the city of Glasgow, I know how difficult they are having an impact in stopping that situation running out of control. But the case number today is high. I was looking at, because obviously you need to look at the not just the overall case number, but the positivity rate. So, Glasgow's positivity rate in today's figures is 10.8, which is higher than we would want it to be. It's not the highest in Scotland. Lanarkshire today is still a bit higher than that. So, these are, and Glasgow really illustrates the general point I'm making. We have a level of restriction now in each local authority area, and what we have to look at week on week is not just, is that level of restriction stabilising things? So a few weeks ago, I might have been expecting, if the restrictions hadn't worked, to see a situation in Glasgow where you'd have 3 or 4 times the number of daily cases that you have now. We don't. It's broadly stable, maybe fluctuating a bit. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, the current level of restriction in each area sufficient not just to stabilise it, but to get infection levels down? And these are crucial parts of the decision-making process we face. Do you want to add anything to that, Jason?
I agree with you. Two things. The numbers are too high, and transmission is happening. So I've said here before that pretty much every person thinks it's not happening in their home, it's not happening when they go out to retail, it's not happening when they go to the cafe. It's happening somewhere. So every single person and every single sector has to do all they can to protect their customers, each other, our families, from those numbers. So we can't get to 10.8% positivity unless transmission is happening. So we've got to be cautious. We don't want to do more restrictive interventions because we want that number to fall with human behaviour allowing the businesses to remain open. But if it doesn't begin to turn that corner, as I said earlier, then the advice has to be that we need those numbers to be lower.
Chris Musson from The Sun.
Hi, First Minister. Just a brief technical question before my substantive point. On the 50 deaths, would that have been over a number of days? And would it be more sensible to revise daily figures when you can, to report them by the date of death as well? Because obviously Sunday and Monday were quite low this week. So is it possible that some of those 50 deaths were actually from Sunday and Monday? Similarly for tests, I've been wondering in recent weeks why you don't report tests by the date of test as well as the date that they come back to you, which is what I think we've got at the moment. On the more substantive question, on the travel restrictions in law that you're considering putting down, you'll be acutely aware that if you do this, there will be plenty of people who see this as a massive overreach of the state. Why would travel limits need to be set down in law now when they weren't in the first wave? Will police be stopping people at local authority borders, asking for ID to prove where they live? Because that would appear to be the only way to enforce this and the implication of legal restrictions.
On your technical reporting points, we do both of those things. So you go I think, into the NRS report weekly, and you will see deaths by date of death. I said earlier on that what we report in the daily figure is by date of registration, so it is potentially over a period of days, because there will be a gap between somebody dying and their death being registered, but that is reconciled by date of death. Similarly, you will find this both on the Public Health Scotland website and on the UK dashboard. If you go into case data, you will find not just by date of the test being reported, but cases allocated by the date the sample was taken. Now, there is a bit of a lag in that data, because obviously there can be a day or two between the test being taken and the test being reported, but retrospectively that data is all reconciled to date of sample, so that is all there and publicly available. Massive overreach of the state. We're in unprecedented situation. I'm acutely aware every single day of the things that the state, the government, is asking people to do, and on occasion mandating people to do through the law. None of that sits easily, or should ever sit easily, with a democratic politician. But we are in unprecedented circumstances facing a deadly infectious virus, and unfortunately all of these things become part and parcel. Obviously parliamentary scrutiny is important. We are moving into a phase where we're trying to strengthen and bring forward the scrutiny of Parliament into laws and regulations we're passing. But the worst thing any government can do right now is not act quickly when required, and not take the action necessary to stop this virus transmitting, because the consequences of that will be severe. I don't take any of the decisions about guidance versus regulation lightly. Why would you have a different situation now? Firstly, because we are now operating very explicitly on a regional basis. So previously, under the first wave, we had national restrictions. So in a sense, we asked people to stay at home and to stay close to home, but the restrictions were the same in every part of the country. So you couldn't go from Glasgow to Inverness in order to have a pint, because pubs were shut everywhere. When you have a different situation, you clearly have to have more emphasis on travel restrictions. Otherwise, you take the virus from the high prevalence areas to the low prevalence areas, and it spreads everywhere. And why guidance rather than law? Well, if you want to tighten that, then you cannot have the police stopping everybody's journey. But I think we all recognise that when something is put in law, most people realise perhaps more than they do when it's in guidance that it's important. And it does give the police the ability, if they have evidence that people are flagrantly breaching the law, to take action there where that is appropriate. So these things are all careful balances and careful judgments. And counterintuitive it may seem to a journalist or to the public, I can't wait to get back to the day where we don't have what you, to use your terminology, the overreach of the state. This is not an inappropriate overreach of the state. This is if it is that, it is about keeping people safe. And we've got to make sure those checks and balances are right, but not lose sight of that central objective. Tom Gort.
Are you sure that it would be in line with the ECHR to limit freedoms in this way?
We are bound by the ECHR. The Scotland Act has the ECHR built into it, so we have to always satisfy ourselves. That's a difference, I think, between the devolved administrations and the UK government. It's a necessary requirement for us to make an assessment of whether we're ECHR compliant in the things that we do. And these things are all what may be judged to be completely unacceptable in a normal situation. You have to see through a different prism when it is about protecting people's lives. That doesn't mean you cast aside these considerations, but you have to balance all of these things. It's not respecting anybody's human rights right now to allow a virus to spread unchecked that leads to more people dying. That's possibly the ultimate breach of people's human rights. So these things unfortunately are never absolutely black and white. It would be easier if they were, but we try to take these judgments and make these judgments in the best possible way we can. Tom Gordon from the Herald.
Hello there, First Minister. Just a very quick follow-up on Chrissy's point. The sanctions that the police might levy, are we talking simply about financial sanctions, or could people have points put on their licenses if they abuse their cars to travel to areas they shouldn't? And on the American election, obviously coronavirus has been a big issue. I just wondered what you thought the outcome of the election might mean for global efforts on coronavirus and the message on following rules more generally.
On the point about enforcement of travel restrictions, this is not dodging your question. If we decide to put it in law, we'll set out what the enforcement procedures and any potential penalties are at the time we do that. We have tended, as you know, from existing coronavirus regulations to stick within our fixed penalty notice framework, and that would undoubtedly be the starting point and probably what would apply there. But given that we haven't taken final decisions, I don't want to be definitive about ruling anything in or out, but take the fixed penalty notice framework as the most likely enforcement penalty regime that would apply there. On the American presidential election, I'll be brief and well done for managing to ask me that question in the context of COVID. The votes are still being counted. We'll see what the outcome of the election is. I'm not going to go much further than that. I think probably most people can guess which side I fall on in terms of what my preferred outcome of the election would be, but that's not a matter for me. That's a matter for the American people. I think what is most important right now is the integrity of American democracy. All votes should be counted, and I think that is an important principle, and the outcome of the election should be respected. And I won't be the only one who listened to the President's speech earlier this morning with a sense of discomfort and foreboding, and I hope sensible voices in America come to the fore in terms of the protection of the integrity of democracy, whatever the direction the final few state tallies take us in. In terms of COVID, America, the outcome of American elections matter to the whole world, even though the whole world doesn't have a say in them. And that is true on COVID. We want to see, the world's biggest democracy taking a responsible leadership role. And it's really important that whoever emerges as the eventual winner from this, that there is that real focus on making sure that the virus is controlled and suppressed in America, and that in things like vaccines and technological developments, America is playing a responsible role, which I hope would be the case. Mark McLaughlin from The Times.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Probably one for Professor Leitch. I was looking at the latest National Records of Scotland figures, and I've noticed that the excess deaths that aren't attributed to COVID have really flatlined. Have we got a handle on that now? This idea that the restrictions might be killing more people than the virus. I also noticed that they were very high and still unexplained during the full lockdown in April and May. Do we have more of a handle on what was causing these excess deaths that we did in the heat of the moment? And also on the projections, we talked about the projections a couple of days ago. Where do these latest national records figures fit into that projection that you released last Thursday? Are you higher or lower?
Jason.
So I wouldn't classify it as the restrictions caused the excess deaths. I think that's a little too blunt. I think a global pandemic has an effect on disease in the round as well as COVID. So some people in the early stages of the pandemic probably died of COVID and weren't registered as COVID deaths, for example, because we didn't know what COVID did at that stage. There will be, though, some late presentation of cases, and that's why we've run a couple of campaigns, both from here and in the media, about the NHS being open. Come with your cancer lump, come with your bleeding, please don't stay away. So I think around the world we will see excess deaths from the nature of the pandemic and what it did to our health service. We don't have full data or full understanding of every one of them. But right at the beginning of the pandemic, we all said, all of the clinicians around the UK said, the single data point that will, in the end, see what the pandemic has done to the population will be age-adjusted excess deaths. That remains true. But we won't know for quite some time if that is cancer or cardiac disease or COVID, and we may never know the individual detail of it. The NRS data is doing exactly what I thought it would do, tragically, and that is, as I began to see numbers rise of positive cases, hospital admissions rise, ICU admissions rise, deaths would rise. In the first wave, 50-50, 1 in 2 of the ICU cases around the world died. We've now got much better at that. Dexamethasone, earlier oxygen, the death rate is lower in intensive care, but still, if you get to intensive care, you have to be very, very sick, and you have a high chance, unfortunately, of dying once you get there. But our treatment is better, but it is still not good for this disease, so that's why prevention is so much more important.
Simon Johnson from The Telegraph.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Just following up on the questions about travel restrictions and putting them into law. Just to clarify, would the police be able to do things like use automatic number recognition cameras to enforce this, or are you relying entirely on public goodwill? And have you seen a drop in traffic on roads like the M8 since the restrictions came in on Monday? And a question for Professor Leitch as well, if possible. Professor Peter Horby, one of Britain's most eminent epidemiologists and a member of SAGE, told the Commons Science Select Committee this morning that he had the really fantastic news, as he put it, and that the death rates among hospitalised patients has fallen from 30% in the first wave of the pandemic to 15% so far in this wave. And I just wondered if that's a trend we've seen in Scotland. Thank you.
Briefly for me, look, as I've said previously, if we decide to put the traffic restrictions, travel restrictions into law, we'll set out at that point what the enforcement is, and I don't think it really takes us very far for me to preempt or get ahead of that decision. I don't have the most up-to-date traffic and travel data in front of me. Of course, a lot of the traffic on the M8 will be essential work traffic, so it's not, I'm speaking slightly off the top of my head here, it's perhaps not the traffic route that you would most expect to see, because people who don't have to go to work, who can work from home, shouldn't be on that route anyway. But I don't have the up-to-date traffic detail in front of me. Jason?
I haven't seen exactly what Peter said, Simon. In the round, I agree with him. I need to see his actual data, what he's using. That presumably is English hospital data. I don't know our exact numbers. Anecdotally, when I speak to my critical care friends, my acute medicine friends, they're telling me not only are people surviving better, but the conversion rate, if you'll forgive the shorthand, the conversion rate from ward admission to ICU admission is lower. And that would fit with what Simon, that would fit with what Peter is saying. That would suggest we're better at recognising the disease earlier, crucially. And I think that's probably the most important thing that's happening, is we now know how to recognise the disease when people are ill, but we're also better at treating it. But please don't be lulled into a false sense of security. We still don't have good drugs. We still don't have good therapeutics. We're giving oxygen sooner, slightly more invasive oxygen sooner, and then if you get very sick, we're giving steroids. But we have nothing else. So it's not fixed, but it is better than in wave one.
Gina Davidson from The Scotsman.
Hi, thanks, First Minister. Yesterday, you were very clear that only a fool would rule out a new national lockdown. And today, I know at COVID Committee, you were asked about schools and potential for extending the holiday period at Christmas. And again, you said that schools weren't untouchable. And I know all of this is up in the air, but I wondered if you could give parents any idea of what's going on in the background in terms of planning for that kind of thing. Should kids have to be at home again, and in terms of blended learning and learning at home?
We're not actively planning for. I'm not going to stand here and rule anything out, because I think the day you hear me ruling things definitively in and out when we're dealing with a virus, you should probably think I'm not having one of my best days, because that's not sensible to do. But just because I'm not ruling something out doesn't mean we're planning for it to happen. And I know that is kind of a difficult, so where does it sit in the spectrum? We have all sorts of contingency plans, but our clear objective is to keep schools open as far and as long as we possibly can. Why? Because that is, overall, that is better for young people than having them off school again. Young people have already lost months of normal schooling, and I think most people think that's not a good thing, and we should try and avoid that happening again. Doesn't mean we're oblivious to issues of transmission or safety in and around schools, but it means that when we are making our decisions, we will think, well, okay, if our objective is to keep schools open, but still suppress the virus, that may mean that the rest of us, the adults in the country, have to live with slightly more restrictions. So yeah, we might have to have our ability to go to the pub restricted for a bit longer to suppress the virus in that way, in order to create the headroom, if you like, to keep schools open. So these are the judgments we make. Of course, you can never rule out getting to the stage with the transmission of a virus that it is transmitting so far, so fast, it's accelerating, that it's simply not feasible to keep schools open as normal. And in that case, we've got plans for blended learning. We would try to, signal in advance if we thought that was the direction of travel. But our planning objective is to keep schools open for the good of young people. And we will try to, as far as we can, we will try to design our other decisions in a way that facilitates that. Rachel Watson from the Daily Mail.
Thank you, First Minister. I just wanted to go back to the travel bans. Just on the point of police, would you be giving police any extra resources, for example, if they are brought in to stop cars or police borders between the rest of the UK and council areas? And also on the point about ID, I think Chris Musson asked about this, would people be asked to carry their ID to show police if they had travelled? And would you be asking, for example, on public transport, would people who were using trains to travel across the country be asked why they were using those services?
Right, I'll try this again. If we decide to do this, we will set out how it's going to work, and I will stand here a week today and answer all of these questions. We haven't yet decided if we're going to do it that way, and therefore, by definition, we haven't taken all of these secondary decisions that would flow from that. So if that changes, I will answer all of these questions, but until that point, I would purely be speculating, and I don't think that is helpful for anybody. Richard Percival from the Express.
Thank you, First Minister. I just wanted to ask about Christmas. I know you said this morning at the COVID committee that the devolved nations would try to sort of reach a common position. Do you sort of have, I know it's probably too early to say at the moment, do you sort of have an indication of what those kind of measures could be? And have you had any other discussions, or to an extent, what discussions have you had with the other devolved nations and Westminster about this? And I know you said that the current situation was currently fragile with COVID testing in Scotland. What would your position be, say, on saying integrating mass testing into the tier system, as the Scottish Greens have suggested this morning? Thank you.
I didn't say the position was fragile around COVID testing in Scotland. I said the position was fragile around COVID. Just for the avoidance of doubt, these are different statements. We are focused very much on our testing strategy, using the testing technology and infrastructure we have just now. We are also, of course, wanting to deploy as quickly and as effectively as we can any new technology around rapid testing, which opens the door, although there are lots of hurdles to overcome, to potential mass testing. And obviously we will think about the clinical priority of all of that. Richard, on Christmas, I think you've just asked me exactly the same question as you asked me yesterday, and therefore my answer, I'm afraid, 24 hours later is going to be the same. We all know what we want for Christmas, and I don't mean that in terms of presents. I mean that in terms of what we want for the country. We want to have as much normality as we can have. It won't be 100% normality unless something that I'm not foreseeing changes between now and then, but we hope we can get more normality than we have now. I cannot stand here, though, on what date is it, the 3rd or 4th of November, the 4th of November today, of course it's Bonfire night tomorrow, the 4th of November, and tell you exactly what the situation with the virus is going to be on the 25th of December. But we will get more certainty and confidence in that the closer we get, and we will try to coordinate the position with other UK nations, because families are connected across the whole of the UK, so that makes sense. What we can't guarantee right now is not just what position Scotland will be in with the virus, but we can't guarantee that that will be the same position as England or Wales or Northern Ireland are in. So there are just some inherent uncertainties in this, which makes life really difficult for people. I understand that. But I'll stand here every day between now and then and try to take us through this as our knowledge and confidence in the position hopefully increases, or if it doesn't, then I'll take us through that as well. But I'm not going to stand here on anything, but particularly not on something that is so important to people as the Christmas period, and give false assurances, because it makes my life easier for the duration of this briefing. I want to be frank and open and straight with people, and that's what I'll continue to seek to do. Okay, I'm told the last question is not there. I'm going to hand over briefly again to the Chief Fire Officer, because Bonfire Night, of course, is tomorrow, so we can be a bit more certain about the conditions there, just to maybe underline again some of the key messages, because we know in normal years Bonfire Night is a challenging time for the fire service and our other emergency services, but it can be a time of risk and danger for people who are trying to enjoy fireworks as well, but that is more so this year. So please listen to what the Chief Fire Officer has said today, and particularly if you have younger relatives who may be looking to enjoy Bonfire Night, please make sure they know the key messages that the Fire Officer, Chief Fire Officer has given. But I'll hand over to him for the final word on Bonfire Night.
Thank you, First Minister. I think we've already talked about how different life is at the moment, particularly Bonfire Night tomorrow. And what we're trying not to do is to spoil anyone's fun, but what we will try and do is to help you enjoy it safely and securely, so that the busy night that we normally experience doesn't get busier, so that the emergency services are available for other emergencies as they occur. 90% of our incidents during the Bonfire Night, particularly between 5 o'clock in the evening and midnight, are deliberate fires. So please be careful with fireworks. If you haven't used fireworks before, please go to our website, firescotland.gov.uk, and read the advice that's there. Buying fireworks, please buy them from a licensed seller. Please buy fireworks that have a CE mark on them. Please only take them out one at a time and use them one at a time. Never go back to a firework that's not gone off. Please look after your bonfires, never leave them unattended. And please, 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 around sparklers with young children. And we've seen many injuries, many burns with young children during the bonfire season. Please don't give a sparkler to someone who is under 5. Please look after children and monitor them, and look after them when they're using sparklers. Please, one sparkler at a time. When it's finished, please take it away and put it in a bucket of cold water. Sparklers burn between 10 and 20 times hotter than boiling water, and they give severe injuries to young children in particular, become life-changing injuries. And above all, with all of those messages of please don't do this, please look after this, please enjoy yourself, please be safe, please be smart, and please be kind to everyone as we enjoy Bonfire Night together. Thank you very much. First Minister.
Many thanks, Martin, and many thanks to you for joining us today to underline these important messages, and be kind to each other, but be kind to our firefighters as well, who do a great job. But Bonfire Night is a time of particular pressure, so please do not even inadvertently contribute to that. Thank you to all the journalists today. Thanks to Vaughan for our BSL interpretation, to Jason, and in particular today to Martin for joining us, and thanks to all of you. Please continue to abide by the rules and guidance for firework Bonfire Night, but more generally as we try collectively to keep this virus under control. Don't lose sight of the impact you are having through the sacrifices everybody's making right now. The situation that we're reporting every day just now is serious and doesn't make for pleasant hearing, I know that, but it is a much less severe position than would be the case if we didn't have so many people abiding by all of these difficult restrictions. We only have to look across other parts of Europe right now to see many countries with a much more severe position. So that's down to the sacrifices you're making. Please keep doing it, because we have to improve this situation further as we go into winter. So remember all of the advice: don't visit each other's homes, abide by travel guidance, and follow the facts advice. Face coverings, stay away from crowded places, clean hands and surfaces, 2 metres distancing, and self-isolate and get tested if you have symptoms. Thank you again I will join you tomorrow, but from the Scottish Parliament tomorrow at 12:20 when I'll give the daily update and then take part in the weekly session of First Minister's Questions. On Friday, it is possible, perhaps even likely, that the Deputy First Minister will lead the briefing on Friday, as I will be hosting the meeting of the British Irish Council, albeit it will be taking part virtually on Friday morning. But I will see you from the Scottish Parliament tomorrow. Thanks very much.